Welcome, NutritionRadio.org listeners. This is Lonnie Lowry, a university nutrition professor of over 20 years and podcast host of long-running shows like Iron Radio. Come on in. Lecture time. Hey, everybody. Well, today we've got part 3 of the lecture on carbohydrates. It's just a clip, but it includes the promised part on carbohydrate loading. We're also going to talk about carbohydrate types and some other goodies. Just a nice 10-ish minute clip. Let's go into the classroom now. The first slide here shows a couple of pictures of different kinds of carbohydrates. And the important thing is I want you to know that there are low glycemic index carbohydrates. These are slow-acting carbs. And this is what we normally suggest as health professionals. Oats, apples, beans. These are things that have soluble fiber. Soluble fiber forms a gel in your stomach and in your intestines, and that sort of slows down how rapidly the glucose enters your bloodstream. So if it's less than 55 on the GI scale, on the glycemic index scale, that's a low glycemic index carbohydrate. High glycemic index carbs, they have a glycemic index over 70. So these rush into your blood very quickly. The blood glucose spikes very quickly in your blood. And I'm going to move toward doing a laboratory with this because you can demonstrate this in labs. I've done this before. I'd have students eat the same amount of carbohydrates, like, 50 grams of carbohydrates. And one student would do it as some kidney beans and an apple, and another would do it as white bread. And boy, that white bread, you could see that their blood sugar would spike in 30 to 60 minutes. And the people who ate the apple and the beans barely a rise at all. They'd get a very mild rise in blood sugar. So usually that's better. Anyway, there are times for high glycemic index carbohydrates, really just with athletes. Most people, these might be a treat, but they're not the kind of things we would focus on for weight control and health. But for an athlete after exercise, high glycemic index is actually good. So mid and post-exercise. What are some examples? Like I said, white bread, cornflakes, very high glycemic index, white rice, and sports drinks. We want sports drinks to have a high glycemic index to get into your blood very quickly, the sugar, the glucose, because you need the fuel. You need it now. You don't have time for that apple to slowly trickle in because you are performing now. Okay. The next slide talks about carbohydrate timing recommendations. This is a text-heavy slide. A lot of this is based on carbohydrate recommendations based on Davis, 1999. That's an older paper? Sure it is. We've known this for a long time. A lot of the work with carbohydrate windows after exercise and whatnot, Mike Sherman back in the 70s, John Ivey, some of the founding fathers of sports nutrition and exercise physiology did this work decades ago. So Davies recommends 200 grams during the 4 hours prior to performance exercise. That would be for muscle growth or for performance. 200 grams is a lot. Yes, that's a lot. Immediately pre-exercise, so not like 4 hours before in a pregame meal, but immediately before, they usually suggest something like a sports drink, 30 to 50 grams in 300 to 500 milliliters of fluid. So 30 to 50 grams, we're talking about 15 to 45 minutes prior to exercise. Avoid high concentrations of fructose beverages. Fructose is more passively absorbed in the intestines. It can hang around and cause discomfort. So generally, if athletes aren't hungry, if they don't want to have an apple, let's say, before exercise, or some nice slow-acting carb, they might just sip a sports drink. Because even though sports drinks are high glycemic, if you sip it slowly, you're making it a little more steady as far as the blood sugar changes. So even if athletes are trying to get their head in the event, they can still sip the beverage. There is a note on here, caution because of rebound hypoglycemia. If you have an athlete chug a sports drink like an hour before an event, their blood sugar might spike at 30 minutes and actually crash right as the event begins. And then you've got a weak, shaky athlete on your hands. So you have to be careful with that. We've known about rebound hypoglycemia since the 70s. Again, this is not a problem after exercise begins. It's just you can mistime it before exercise. Once you start exercising, your sympathetic nervous system kicks in, and that blunts the insulin response. So you your blood sugar won't spike and then be driven very, very low, because you're just not going to produce much insulin once you're exercising. So during exercise, not a problem. You just don't want to have someone chug something sugary an hour or 90 minutes before an event. 30 to 60 grams per hour during the exercise. This isn't just Davis. This is ACSM recommendations. 30 to 60 grams, that's probably something I'll ask you, per hour is what you're supposed to get. So sports drinks in many ways really are better than water. They maintain your blood glucose. They spare glycogen. They even reduce the stress response, believe it or not. We'll talk about this briefly, but you have immune proteins like interleukin-6 that are inflammatory and catabolic, right? They tend to break down tissue. Stress hormones like cortisol, these things get eased. They get suppressed somewhat when you have carbohydrates in the fluid and not just water. So even though it's just sugar water sold at a premium price, in fact, this is something you could think about on your assignment today, the sports drink assignment, but they can actually reduce the stress response. You don't really feel anything today. You might feel a little less fatigued during the exercise bout, but over the course of a season, you very well could see less overtraining kind of symptoms because of reduced interleukin-6 and cortisol. After exercise, we crank it up a little bit to a gram per kilogram of body weight. So if you weigh 80 kilos, that'd be 80 grams of some type of fast-acting carbohydrate. I'm actually a fan of kids' cereals. Lucky Charms. I have a weakness for Lucky Charms. Corn Flakes we talked about already, very high glycemic index. But kids' cereals are great because A, they're high glycemic index. B, they often include dairy because you're consuming them with milk. That gives you nice quality protein after the workout too. And C, they have a multivitamin mixed into them. If you ever looked at the side of a cereal box, you'll see lots of vitamins and minerals packed in there. So just very handy. That's the kind of thing I would not recommend anytime except after exercise. The next slide, it has the carbohydrate and fluid timing recommendations based on the ACSM. This is very straightforward, and I tend to ask you this on tests. 500 milliliters, that's like a regular 16, 17-ounce sports drink, 2 hours before exercise. So you're actually starting to prehydrate and preload carbs by sipping on a sports drink. I would not chug it 90 minutes beforehand. Then about a coffee cup, half a coffee cup to a coffee cup worth, so 150 to 350 milliliters, every 15 to 20 minutes during exercise. Most coaches don't do that. I try to encourage that as best I can. Again, not only would it help reduce fatigue, but it would also suppress some of those stress responses. So 150 to 350 milliliters about every 15 or 20 minutes during the exercise, and these should be dilute. This is key, and this relates to your assignment today that you're going to do after lecture. It should be a 4 to 8%, and that's very weak. It's very dilute carbohydrate solution. The carbs enhance the fluid absorption. So not only do you get the carbs in, the carbs actually rush the fluid into your bloodstream faster than just water alone. So again, better than just plain water. They get overdone sometimes, over-recommended, over-hyped. I see a lot of armchair quarterback kind of guys doing this stuff. They probably don't need sports drinks. Or if someone's on their way to the stepper to go do some fat-burning exercise, I would not drink a sugary sports drink on the way. That's going to blunt the fat-burning response. But for people who are into performance and they need calories, this is how we do it. There's also a little bit of sodium in there. Not only does that enhance the palatability or the taste, your desire to chug it, also sodium enhances the glucose absorption. So these are important things that can help you with your assignment. The next slide I put a big star on. This one makes headlines for me. This is how to carb load. So endurance athletes, if they need about 500 or 600 calories a day, that can be up to 70% of their calorie intake as carbs. So most of everything they eat is carbs because they keep burning them all with all their activity. So carb loading, how would you do this? Well, first you would start during the 2-hour post-exercise window. So let's say 3 or 4 days before a big event, you do your final workout, And then take advantage of that, because within that 2-hour window after a workout, glycogen synthase, we know that enzyme that builds glycogen, GLUT4, those transporters, these are very active and they want to grab blood glucose. So give it to them. So you'd start your carb loading right after your final workout. Again, this would be actually 3 to 7 days before an event, depending on how long you want to carb load. And then you consume 8 to 10 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of your body weight each day. Again, for 3 to 7 days. So take 10 times your weight in kilos, if you know your weight in kilos. So I'm about 90 kilos, so that's 900 grams of carbohydrates. It's just a ridiculous amount. I've carb loaded before, and I've actually shown students how you can gain quite a bit of weight. Each gram of glycogen you store is stored with 3 grams of water. So in a medium to large size person, you can see them gain 3 to 5 pounds. It's amazing. High glycemic index carbohydrates are preferable in the early part of the carb load. But again, do that for yourself. What's, 10 grams times your weight in kilos? And imagine that. I've seen athletes eat pie filling, drink lots of sugar. It's really hard to get that much carbohydrate in your body. They're going through whole loaves of white bread with jam on it, stuff like that. It's actually kind of funny. But why do they do the carb loading? Again, they can get 2.5 times their normal amount of glycogen. Now you might think, well, what if they're heavier? Would that hurt their aerobic performance? Maybe their marathon times would be worse because they're actually carrying an extra 3 pounds. Generally not. Researchers have looked at that very closely, and even though it's more work early in the race, it more than pays off with the sense of energy and the reduced fatigue throughout the race.
Okay, so I hope that was enlightening. Carbohydrate types, the magnitude of what happens during a carb load, plus what it takes, right? Oh my goodness. As well as some timing recommendations from classic, sports nutrition, exercise physiology governing bodies. But that's enough. That's 3 parts on this lecture on carbs. I think that's going to be fine for now. We'll change the topic to something else next time. As always, please leave a review on iTunes if you would. I just want to craft the show and follow your feedback. But until then, eat carbs in whichever way you feel is best for you, and we'll see you next time. The NutritionRadio.org podcast is for informational purposes only. If you're interested in starting a diet or exercise program, check with your physician, nutritionist, or qualified exercise physiologist in order to make the progress that you need.